Welcome to Cinema Then, Cinema Now, the film series with lively discussion. I'm your host, Jerry Carlson, and I teach cinema studies at the College of Staten Island. Today we'll be seeing Alain Resnais' Muriel. Produced in 1963, I think you'll find this film of interest on a whole number of counts. It's a gorgeous color film. In addition to that, it's a formally innovative narrative. And even further, it's quite a politically engaged film. We'll be talking about this and a host of other matters after the film. Today our guests are going to be Professor Giuliana Bruno of the College of Staten Island and Professor Jonathan Buchsbaum of Queens College. Enjoy Muriel.
Totally incomprehensible. I mean, it's actually a great
talk
review.
about Hegel and Screwball.
Welcome back to Cinema Then, Cinema Now. I hope you enjoyed Muriel. Today we've got two guests, and I'd like to introduce them to you. First, we have Professor Giuliana Bruno, who's teaching both at the College of Staten Island and at Princeton these days. She's an editor of a magazine. The magazine is On Stage and is a magazine of film and the performing arts. In addition to that, she has significant interests in the relationship of women to film. Second guest today, Professor Jonathan Buchsbaum, who teaches in the Department of Communication, Arts and Sciences at Queens College. His significant interests in political filmmaking, specifically the French tradition, but broader than that. And from there, I think we should just move on into talking about this fascinating and perplexing in a whole set of ways, film Muriel. Jonathan, I wanted to start just by asking you about some of the background of this film. It's a film that's over 20 years old. It's French. It was made in a particular context, and some of that context might be a little bit lost to us. I mean, can you help us?
Well, I'll say a couple of things first before elaborating on it later, which I'm sure will come out in the discussion. I mean, the film was made at the end of 1962 and was released in July of 1963 in France. Resnais had kind of made his reputation with his two previous feature films last year, Marienbad and Hiroshima Mon Amour, but this film was a lot less successful, and perhaps one of the reasons that it was less successful is that it was made about a contemporary political event that had really convulsed France during the 50s and the early 60s, which was the Algerian War. And rather than elaborating on that particular context now, though I will say that when we're talking about the early 60s in France, we're obviously talking about the New Wave, and Resnais was part of the New Wave, though he was also somewhat apart in that he was concerned with certain kinds of formal experiments and political ideas which the other directors were less interested in, I think. However, when I talk about formal experiment, I'm thinking about, in Muriel in particular, the difficulty of actually following a great deal of what's going on in the film. There's a great deal of ambiguity about it. And perhaps I could just elucidate a couple of these ambiguities, but I also don't want to remove them since I think those ambiguities are central to understanding the film, appreciating the ambiguities. So, for example, the film is called Muriel. It's about a character. It refers to a character named Muriel, whom we never see in the film. I think that's significant. In addition, we have characters who apparently lie about the past, or at least we're not sure exactly what happened in the past, that the film deals with events that happened in the past, though we never actually get to see the past necessarily. Those characters who are talking about the past are Alphonse and Alain, or Hélène, who apparently knew each other just before the war and are having a rendezvous after some 25 years. However, a more curious character, perhaps, is the character who increasingly inserts himself into the story of Hélène and Alphonse, trying to locate where Alphonse is. Well, this, in fact, is the brother-in-law of Alphonse. Alphonse is married to Simone, the sister of Ernest. Bernard is the stepson of Alain,
Right.
whom she adopted during the war after marrying his father, and he has just returned from military service in Algeria, or just returned, some 8 months it's referred to in the film. Ernest finally does find Alphonse, and we have this very dramatic incident at the end of the film when he relates that everything we'd been led to believe about Alphonse, in fact, is untrue. That he had never been in Algeria, apparently, that he was, in fact, married to his sister, and, of course, at this point, we're somewhat befuddled because we had been led to believe that he had been in Algiers and he told these stories which are now unmasked as lies. And perhaps, just as a final comment about the characters, we have a character show up in the very last shot of the film, whom we'd never seen before. She's not identified even. But presumably, this character is Simone, who has come to look, the wife of Alphonse, who has come to look for Alphonse herself in Bologna. So, perhaps that'll make it a little bit clearer in terms of following some of how the characters interrelate,
Right.
but perhaps we now want to consider...
Because all of this is not presented at all in the film in a linear or continuous manner. And the film is really only understandable as a whole when we get probably to that last scene, and not even, because instead of stressing the continuity of the story, instead of stressing the film as a continuous flow, Resnais stresses an idea of fragmentation of time and space, which is probably the most important structural feature of the film. Perhaps the best example of it is the very beginning of the film. We are placed in no time and no space. The film begins with a very fragmented montage, a series of shots which do not seem to have any apparent linkage. There is certainly no link of cause and effect between one of another. And we see random details, close-ups of different parts of a woman's body, maybe two women's bodies, and objects such as a coffee pot or a chandelier, and a woman's foot and a handbag and somebody opening a door. But it's not an action which moves continuously, therefore the spectator is somewhat disoriented because he can't figure out what this film is going to be about. It's very different from one of the most important conventions of narrative cinema, which is an establishing shot, a shot that tells us very clearly, here we are, let's say, in Manhattan, and then this is the apartment of our character, and that's what's going to happen. We are instead introduced here to a character who has no importance, and there is no dramatic events being shown. It has throughout, I think, the rest of the film as well. The moments which are emphasized are not necessarily the most dramatic moments in the structure of the film, and there is always a sense in which time and space are fragmented and are stressed in their lack of continuity more than in their discontinuous matter.
You know, it's perhaps interesting to talk now about the fact that this is really his third film. That's something that Jonathan had mentioned before, and Resnais at this point had a considerable audience internationally for his films, and that those films had both dealt also with the question of the past and its relationship to the experience of characters in the present, both in some sense for their original audiences notoriously fragmentary, notoriously difficult, but in intriguing ways it certainly led. But the thing about Hiroshima Mon Amour, the first, and Last Year at Marienbad, and there's a second, even though there are significant differences between them, is that the past, whether hypothetically or concretely, is shown. That is, I mean, Resnais is one of the directors most famous for innovative use of flashback. We don't have that here. I mean, we have a different kind of fragmentation.
But that's exactly why the film is so interesting. It's because it is a film about memory, it's a film about past, but it's a film which refuses to show us directly that past, which instead questions the past and the representation of the past, as well as it questions the representation of the present and the cinematic process itself. therefore, it is this very fragmented structure of the visual, which tells us something about the difficulty of speaking about a past event which is not only individual, but it's also a collective past events. And also...
I think this extends as well, not only to the past, but to the present in Muriel, which makes it particularly interesting because, yes, there's no representation of the past per se, with one significant exception, which we can talk about in a moment perhaps, but in the very opening sequence that Giuliana was talking about a moment ago, you can't even orient yourself in the present. So that the film, in a way, is demonstrating and asserting the difficulty of constructing a coherence of time and space, if you will, but also of narrative logic, even in the present. That, in fact, the conventions that establish notions of coherence in this so-called classical paradigm or classical film are simply conventions. And Resnais is indicating the difficulty of accepting those conventions when he's trying to make a film about a contemporary reality which he feels is a significant one at that moment, specifically the war in Algeria. Though I think that, in fact, you can find indications of this as well in something like Marienbad, because you said that in both Marienbad and Hiroshima Mon Amour, the past is represented. But it seems to me that part of the difficulty of Marienbad is to say, what's the past, what's the present, was there a past, is there a present, and to try and unravel how that structure is constructed in the film.
No, I couldn't agree with you more. And there's a logical progression among the three films of a singular concrete past that's recovered in Hiroshima. It's put into question how long you can hold on to that recovery. And then you get into Marienbad, you get into the whole world of the conjectural. How do we draw the line between what is a concrete recovery of a past, however tentative, and what is a conjectural recovery of a past we don't even know that it existed, and which draws into question the status of that image. I mean, if the image is up on the screen, isn't it something real? And of course, Marienbad begins to abolish those sorts of things.
And Muriel does it probably more to a certain extent, because this past is continually evoked, and it's evoked in language, but the visual do not show us. We see little signs like photographs and the film within the film, but nothing that consistently really tells us what happened or what this past that's haunting all the characters is really about. And this dialectics between the past and the present is really very central and very difficultly expressed in the way in which the visuals are organized versus, for example, the soundtrack. While there are a lot of indications of disorientation and fragments in the visuals, the sound works in a different way. It's, for example, in those montage sequences when the time is so much condensed after they've come back from the station into the apartment, and then afterwards we see the characters in the streets, and we do not necessarily know where they're coming from or where they're going, whether they're meeting each other, and something like a week or 2 weeks goes by in a very condensed time on the screen. And the only way in which we are able to understand that, it's because the music, it gives us a certain kind of continuity. So the music as well works in this text in order to make certain comments which the image does not make in terms of continuity versus discontinuity. While, for example, they're walking in the street to go back from the station, we see alternation of night and day. And very intentionally, Resnais puts us in the position of not exactly knowing what time this is taking place, or what is, what are those shots, where are we? I mean, do they belong to the same city? And then we go back to this continuity, and they go back to the apartment. But there is a way in which that also, I think, relates to the story itself. Time is out of joint, as well as the characters are out of joint. They don't meet. They don't, or they touch for a second, and there's this continuous detours which are emphasized by all those chance meetings, for example, in the streets, in which it seems like they're getting together, but they never actually quite do. So it's really felt. The idea of the detour of time, of the sense of passing of time, and the fragmentation of time is very much felt as the fragmentation of the life of these characters is emphasized. And as a matter of fact, I think this film works in a completely opposite logic from the classic conventions of narrative, to go back to this idea, is that at the beginning the characters meet, and by the end of the film they disperse. While normally we have at the beginning of a film something missing, or an information missing, or a murder, and the film makes up for it, and in the end there will be a resolution of sorts and a sense of closure. Here it's the completely opposite process, in that they seem to get together and they split by the end of the film.
You know, there's an interesting analogy here with an American film that didn't do very well, but that's quite highly regarded by some people, and that is Robert Altman's A Wedding, a number of years ago. Because the classical pattern, not only just in classical film, but in comedy, is of course you move through the resolution of difficulties among different generations, and you move towards the celebration of unity through a gathering together in the celebration of marriage. And of course, one of the things that Altman does in that film is he begins with the marriage and then moves from there towards the disintegration of why all these people can't maintain that unity, and it ends with the dispersal of all the characters. I bring it up just because it's an analogy in a narrative pattern, and also it suggests ways in which the influence of somebody like Resnais, whether you can draw it as a direct influence or just as the kind of the climate created by the French New Wave and the revisions in the agenda of narrative construction that they suggest for American film, for all kinds of other national cinemas as well. Well, what about, we said we'd come back to this notion of the film within the film, that clue of the past. What, I mean, there's a whole host of things to be said about it, and among that host, why don't you begin with?
Well, I think one of the things that's interesting about the footage from Algeria, and after all, we were talking about the past a moment ago, if you think for a moment, all of the representations of Algeria are done, in a sense, secondhand, or that is, at a second degree. Because we see photographs, presumably of Algeria. We see a diary or a journal kept by Bernard, apparently, from Algeria. And we see these images in the Super 8 film, or in the 8mm film, that he's taken of Algeria. That is, Algeria is never present in the same cinematic register as the rest of the film, such as the opening sequence, for example, the ending sequence, whatever. So, when we see, however, the Algerian footage, which is fairly washed out, we see entirely anodyne images where virtually nothing is happening. We see soldiers lounging around, we see buildings that people enter, we see the desert. I mean, really, it's not giving us any information about what seems to be troubling Bernard on an individual level, and perhaps on a larger social level. What was this problem of Algeria in France in 1962 and 1963? Well, it's curious, therefore, that we don't have access to this information through images. Rather, we have to rely excuse me, on the soundtrack, which he is providing in his voiceover to his friend as they're sitting there watching it. So that, once again, you have an opposition, or if you like, a dialectic between the sound and the image, where the image is the impoverished part of the pair. That is, the image is not giving us information, the sound is providing that information. Now, in terms of contextualizing it, this was exactly the situation, in fact, of French cinema in the early 60s, because French censorship would not allow any coverage, visual coverage, in the newsreels, for example, of the real situation in Algeria, which people were well aware of. After all, I mean, prominent intellectuals were signing manifestos encouraging French soldiers to desert from the army. Resnais, in fact, signed one of these manifestos with Sartre and many others. It was a very famous manifesto. So that in this single motion picture reference within the film to Algeria, the image is not contributing information, the sound is. So that you have to appreciate not only the elimination of information visually, but as well the separation of elements in the film, the elements of the filmmaking apparatus itself. Because yes, we see the film, but we also see all other parts of the apparatus of filmmaking in the film. We see an empty screen, and the screen on which, the same screen on which this film is projected. We see a camera. We see an editing table. We see a slide. We see photographs. In other words, Resnais is obviously concerned on some level to have us think about the way films are constructed. And he's showing us a film that is constructed by one of the characters that, unfortunately, visually does not show us anything, and hence this is why, as well, Resnais has always been associated with, and I think he's been concerned about, montage, because this poses the problem of how to present real things, let alone the past, through images. And he recognizes the difficulty of individual images without any cutting conveying sense or meaning. Hence the significance of the final shot of the film.
Right, that's why, right, he doesn't, he emphasizes the process of filmmaking itself, and he emphasizes all those cuts, he emphasizes the ellipses in times, he emphasizes all the fragmentation of cinema instead of making it look as if it was a continuous flow of images. And it's interesting, as you were mentioning, that the only time in which we see something continuously, we see nothing. And that's that last shot in which Simone enters the room, and it's a very long take, the longest take of, I think it lasted something like a minute and a half, while we've seen only a few seconds before of shots, and she tours around the apartment and nothing is shown to us. And I think that's really the most striking metaphor of this idea that there is a difficulty in visualizing in the past, this collective past and this individual past, while the language plays a more important role. We are told, for example, the truth, so to speak, by Ernest, or the story of Muriel is told to us. And we don't see it, as you mentioned before, and it's probably in the line of the other work of Resnais. As we mentioned, Marienbad or Hiroshima Mon Amour are also very much relying on language. Resnais used to work with writers, not screenwriters, but real writers, and he had a real interesting eye for it because, for example, Marguerite Duras worked with him and wrote a script for Hiroshima Mon Amour, and the writers such as Alain wrote a script for Marienbad. And these are both people who then went on and made films of their own. So there is a way in which he emphasizes this importance of language by also being so much so interested in choosing the right people.
One of the things that Resnais has been accused of, I think it's an inaccurate charge, I think it's a shallow charge, but one of the things he's been accused of is being this abstract formalist in some way, only interested in experimentation, in cinematic technique, that sort of thing. One of the things that you're both talking about is very interesting. It may not be that we can ever settle exactly the chicken and egg issue with Resnais, but the introduction of the material like the home movies from Algiers suggests that that formal innovation of reversing the sound-image relationship comes from a set of political needs in representation. One, in a certain sense, he's working under the set of restrictions of censorship you noticed, but also that he's revealing exactly what those terms are. So if we call it formally innovative, on the one hand, we have to say it's formally innovative because it must be done this way. The only way to represent a certain kind of political experience in France in this way is not through the traditional, the classical means of narrative cinema.
I think that's true, and I think that that charge is one that's probably based primarily on last year Marienbad, and to a lesser extent, a far lesser extent, on Hiroshima Mon Amour. But, I mean, Resnais also worked on a whole series of shorts throughout the 1950s. I mean, he made an extremely powerful film in 1955 about the concentration camps called Night and Fog.
Night and Fog, yes.
Right. Written, by the way, by the same screenwriter who wrote Muriel.
Jean Carroll?
Jean Carroll.
Carroll.
So that he obviously, I think as you say, was interested in political and social questions, throughout his career, which we can find evidence of throughout the shorts that he made during the 50s. And I think that the film that really catapulted him to fame was Hiroshima Mon Amour,
Right.
and then his subsequent success with Marienbad, which had a great success in America also, I think led people to see him as formally innovative and somewhat distanced from, let's say, social issues. But I agree with you that that's basically a misrepresentation, though not a total one. And I'd also like to add something to what Giuliana was saying a moment ago, or perhaps in terms of contextualizing him a bit more. With Marienbad, excuse me, and Hiroshima Mon Amour, he is dealing with the problem of memory, the problem of the past. But these are individual problems. That is, we can identify who these central characters are, and that it's personal obsessions and memories that these films are concerned with. And in Muriel, we no longer have that. In fact, quite the contrary. He wants to transcend, in a way, this question of personal memories and move it on to the level of collective memories. And finally, going back once again to this point about the final image, or the final shot, which does last roughly for 1.5 minutes, I think this relates also to what Giuliana was talking about when she mentioned dispersal. Because through the film, there are a number of sequences which begin in a highly elliptical, a highly fragmented way, and move toward some type of greater continuity.
Right.
The opening sequence is an example of that. We do get a demonstration of greater coherence. There's a meal sequence which begins with several close shots of a bird cage, various elements at the meal. People are talking. In fact, the content of the discussion is, where was a certain building before the war, before the bombing, and so forth. And it moves toward a sense of coherence, so that by the end, we have this spatially, temporally coherent shot that lasts 1.5 minutes, which is obviously shown to be inadequate to add any information for us as viewers. So that on the narrative level, there's a dispersal as the characters move off, all in different directions. I mean, to the train station, on a bus, wherever. But in terms of the editing and the spatiotemporal coherence, we have a movement toward spatiotemporal coherence, which obviously is shown to be empty of meaning by the end.
Yeah, it's all, the editing is, well, something we've been talking a great deal about and is of great interest. You were saying earlier, Giuliana, that it really almost reverses the priorities of classical. I mean, one of the ways I think of that is that the classical norm is, of course, you begin with establishing shot. I mean, there are just thousands and thousands of examples we could use. I frequently, when I talk to my students, since all of them seem to have seen The Odd Couple on television at some point. Every time you go to the apartment of these characters in New York, you see a shot of the apartment building, then you see a shot of their window, then you go inside. And here we get a reversal in a lot of ways of that. We begin with a kind of fragmentation. We build, I'm thinking of scenes within the film, we build into a kind of order, and then we lapse away into fragmentation again. So we don't begin with order. The normal way to shoot is you begin with order, then you cut it up so you can see individual people talking, then you go back to order. But here, it seems the reverse procedure, and then when we do get this order established, as you said, it demonstrates so what? So what have you learned with that?
There's also a way in which the editing works also to emphasize things that don't seem so dramatic or so important. We see very little dramatic events being shown, except for that moment in which the truth is revealed, and then finally somebody takes action. But it's once again because of the sound. Bernard hears the sound and the machine, and therefore he is led to action. He goes off and kills Robert.
Yeah, you're referring to when he grabs the tape recorder, and the tape recorder plays these screams, which presumably of Muriel. That's not necessarily clear, I think, on first viewing. And that dramatic event stands out in the film against all of the succession of banalities that are exchanged verbally, and that demonstrates once again the difficulty of making dramatic fiction films about a political event of this importance.
Yeah.
So,
You know, that might be, ending on this note of difficulty but fascination, that might be a good place for us to stop for a few moments. What I'd like to do now is to turn to the audience and let them know that if you'd like more information about Cinema Then, Cinema Now, you can send a self-addressed stamped envelope to Cinema Then, Cinema Now, the College of Staten Island, New York, 10301. Let me give you that information again. Write to Cinema Then, Cinema Now, the College of Staten Island, New York, 10301. I hope that our discussion here about Muriel leads you to thought and discussion that you enjoy. Thanks again for joining us.